George Lindsey truly hated her more than anyone. The words are sharp, intriguing, and almost shocking. For audiences who adored George Lindsey as the lovable, bumbling Goober Pyle on The Andy Griffith Show, the idea that he carried a deep animosity toward anyone seems out of place. Yet behind the laughter and the endearing smile, there was a man whose journey was shaped not just by comedy, but by struggle, passion, and very human conflicts. Born George Smith Lindsey on December 17, 1928 in Fairfield, Alabama, he entered the world during the tail end of the Roaring Twenties, a time that was about to shift dramatically into the hardships of the Great Depression. His parents, George Ross Lindsey and Alice Smith Lindsey, were working-class folks who instilled in their son the values of hard work, humility, and persistence. Fairfield, a small town outside Birmingham, offered little glamour, but it gave George roots in Southern culture, a charm he would later bring to his performances. From a young age, George displayed a knack for humor. Friends recalled that he was the class clown, quick with a joke, often able to lighten tense moments. But his childhood was not entirely carefree. Like many families of the era, the Lindseys faced financial strain. Yet George's parents encouraged his creativity, allowing him to find joy in storytelling, mimicry, and small-town theatrics. He attended Walker County High School, where his charisma and humor set him apart. Though athletic and popular, George felt drawn to something deeper than sports or small-town life. After graduating, he enrolled at Florence State Teachers College, now the University of North Alabama. There he majored in physical education, seemingly headed for a career as a coach or teacher. But college also provided exposure to theater, and it was in the world of performance that George found his true calling. At Florence, George honed his comedic timing on stage, performing in school productions. Professors and classmates noted his natural ability to embody characters, particularly those with a comedic bent. After college, he briefly served in the United States Air Force, a detour that gave him discipline and perspective. But upon returning, George decided to chase his passion for acting more seriously. With determination, he moved to New York, enrolling in the prestigious American Theater Wing, the same training ground that shaped countless Broadway talents. It was here that George refined his craft, embracing not just comedy but dramatic roles as well. The move was risky, especially for a young man from Alabama with little financial security, but it set the stage for everything to come. The boy from Fairfield had transformed into a man determined to carve his place in entertainment. Yet success would not come easily. Before he would become beloved by millions, George would have to endure rejection, struggle, and the uncertainty of a career in the arts. George Lindsey's early years in show business were marked by resilience. Like so many aspiring actors arriving in New York City in the 1950s, he faced a wall of rejection. He took on odd jobs, working in retail, waiting tables, and even teaching to support himself while attending auditions. He appeared in small stage productions, honing his craft but struggling to find steady work. Television was rapidly becoming America's favorite medium, and George saw it as the gateway to opportunity. He began to land small television parts in the early 1960s, appearing on shows like The Twilight Zone, The Alfred Hitchcock Hour, and Gunsmoke. These guest spots didn't make him famous, but they showcased his versatility. His breakthrough came in 1964, when he was cast in The Andy Griffith Show as Goober Pyle, the cousin of the beloved Gomer Pyle played by Jim Nabors. At first, the role was meant to be minor, but George's goofy charm, trademark wide smile, and impeccable comedic timing won over audiences. Soon, Goober became a fixture of the series, and George found himself a household name. Goober's antics in Mayberry made him one of the most recognizable characters in television history. Whether he was misinterpreting the simplest situations or trying to impress with his corny impressions, George created a character that embodied both innocence and hilarity. Working alongside Andy Griffith, Don Knotts, and Ron Howard, George became part of a legendary ensemble cast that defined an era of television. When The Andy Griffith Show ended in 1968, George carried the role of Goober into the spin-off Mayberry RFD, and later appeared on Hee Haw, the variety show that combined country music and comedy. On Hee Haw, George was able to lean into his Southern roots, playing not just Goober, but also delivering skits and humor that resonated with rural and suburban audiences alike. Despite his success, George faced the challenge of typecasting. The role of Goober was so iconic that casting directors often struggled to see him as anyone else. He longed for more dramatic opportunities, roles that would allow him to demonstrate his range, yet his fame as Goober remained both a blessing and a limitation. Over the years, George found steady work in television, guest starring in shows like Love American Style, MASH, and The Glenn Campbell Good Time Hour. He also lent his voice to animated projects, including The Aristocats and Robin Hood, further diversifying his career. While George never escaped Goober entirely, he embraced the character as a part of his legacy. Fans adored him, and his performances brought laughter to millions. Still, behind the laughter, there lingered frustrations, personal struggles, and relationships that were far more complicated than his on-screen persona suggested. Away from the cameras, George Lindsey's personal life was filled with moments of joy, but also with struggles and disappointments. His most significant relationship was with his wife, Joyce Ann Lindsey, whom he married in 1955. Joyce, supportive of George's ambitions, stood by his side through the lean years of auditions and rejection. Together they had 2 children, George Lindsey Jr. and Camilla Lindsey. The marriage, however, was not destined to last. After nearly 2 decades together, George and Joyce divorced in 1980. The reasons were deeply personal, tied to the strains of his career, the pressures of fame, and the challenges of balancing family life with Hollywood. Despite the end of their marriage, George maintained a relationship with his children, who remembered him as both a dedicated father and a complex man. George did not remarry after Joyce. Instead, he focused much of his energy on his career and on philanthropic efforts. He was particularly passionate about supporting education and founded the George Lindsey UNA Film Festival at his alma mater, giving students and filmmakers a platform to showcase their work. His devotion to the festival reflected his desire to inspire future generations. Still, George's romantic life included significant relationships. While he was linked at times to women in the entertainment industry, none developed into long-term commitments. Friends and colleagues noted that George could be charming, but he also carried a streak of melancholy, often reflecting on what might have been had his life taken different turns. His children pursued their own paths. George Lindsey Jr. kept a lower profile, while Camilla carved out her own life outside the spotlight. Though his father was often busy with his career, both children spoke warmly of his humor, generosity, and the way he brought Goober to life at home, just as he did on screen. Relationships with colleagues were more complicated. George was beloved by many, but he was not without tensions. The pressures of working on a successful television show, the challenges of creative differences, and the long hours sometimes led to conflicts. While George valued friendship and loyalty, his strong opinions occasionally clashed with others in the industry. Through it all, George remained a man defined by contradictions, a comedian who sometimes carried sadness, a father who struggled with marriage but found pride in his children, and a performer whose on-screen simplicity masked an off-screen complexity. These personal dimensions would come to the forefront in the story that lay at the heart of his later life, the story of animosity that would surprise even his biggest fans. Now, after decades of speculation, who could inspire such strong feelings from a man so universally beloved for his humor and warmth? The answer, as George himself admitted, was his castmate Frances Bavier, remembered forever as Aunt Bee on The Andy Griffith Show. To audiences, Aunt Bee was the embodiment of gentleness, a matriarch who cared for Andy Taylor, Opie, and even the bumbling residents of Mayberry. She was nurturing, kind, and a symbol of traditional family values. But off-screen, Frances was very different. Trained as a serious stage actress in New York, she brought with her a strict, perfectionist approach to acting. She demanded quiet on set, valued rehearsal above improvisation, and insisted on professionalism at all times. This clashed almost instantly with George's easygoing, joke-filled nature. George had entered the Mayberry world in 1964, eager and grateful for the chance to play Goober Pyle. He loved to improvise, clown around between takes, and bring levity to the set. But Frances viewed this behavior as disruptive. To her, George's looseness undermined the craft of acting. To George, Frances's coldness felt dismissive, even insulting. He often recalled how she spoke to him as though he were less talented or less refined because of his Southern background and comedic style. Their tension rarely boiled into open arguments, but it simmered constantly. Cast and crew noticed that George and Frances almost never interacted warmly. While George shared laughs with Andy Griffith and Don Knotts, and even offered encouragement to a young Ron Howard, his conversations with Frances were clipped, formal, and strained. The difference was obvious enough that others on the set commented on it years later. In later interviews, George spoke bluntly. He admitted that Frances Bavier was the only colleague he could say he truly disliked. He respected her skills. He never denied that she was talented, but he could not overlook what he felt was her superiority complex and her dismissive treatment of him. "She was Aunt B to the world," George once said, "but to me, she was something else entirely." The bitterness in his words revealed how deeply he had internalized their friction. It is worth noting that Frances herself had her struggles. By the end of the Andy Griffith Show, she was weary of the role and often felt trapped by the image of Aunt B. That frustration sometimes spilled over into her relationships with her co-stars. While some, like Andy Griffith, tried to understand her perspective, George never reconciled with her. To him, the damage was done. For fans who imagine the Mayberry cast as a real-life family, George's candor was shocking. It shattered the illusion that everything behind the scenes was as harmonious as on-screen. Yet in another sense, it made George more human. His willingness to admit dislike, even hatred, was not an act of cruelty, but of honesty. He had spent years carrying the frustration, and in speaking it aloud, he revealed the reality that even the warmest settings can conceal deep rifts. In the end, the animosity between George Lindsey and Frances Bavier was less about any single incident than about irreconcilable worldviews. The formal stage actress and the playful comedian locked in a quiet battle of temperament. Their story stands as a reminder that entertainment, no matter how idyllic it looks, is still built by imperfect, complex human beings. And in sharing his truth, George allowed audiences to see him not just as Goober, but as a man unafraid to reveal his most candid feelings. As the years passed, George Lindsey came to terms with the dual nature of his legacy. Though forever linked to Goober Pyle, he found comfort in knowing that the character had brought genuine joy to millions of households. In interviews, he often laughed about the typecasting, acknowledging that he couldn't escape Goober, but also admitting that there were far worse things than being remembered for making people smile. He poured much of his later energy into giving back. In 1998, he helped establish the George Lindsey UNA Film Festival at his alma mater, the University of North Alabama. The event quickly grew into one of the Southeast's most respected showcases for student filmmakers. George's presence there each year was more than ceremonial. He mentored, encouraged, and celebrated the next generation of storytellers. For him, the festival was a way to close the circle, offering to young artists the kind of support he wished he'd had when leaving Alabama decades earlier. His philanthropic work extended beyond the festival. George was a longtime supporter of the Special Olympics, often appearing alongside Andy Griffith and other castmates at charity events. He spoke passionately about the importance of laughter and inclusion, using his fame to raise both awareness and funds. In these moments, audiences saw the heart of the man behind Goober, generous, empathetic, and deeply rooted in community. By the 1990s, acting opportunities had slowed, but George remained a popular figure at conventions, reunions, and television specials. He relished telling stories from the set of The Andy Griffith Show, usually delivered with his trademark self-deprecating humor. Fans adored hearing the behind-the-scenes anecdotes, even when George candidly admitted that life in Hollywood had been far from perfect. His openness about personal struggles made him relatable, proof that fame never insulated him from life's ups and downs. On May 6, 2012, George Lindsey passed away in Nashville, Tennessee from heart failure. He was 83 years old. The news prompted an outpouring of tributes. Andy Griffith mourned the loss of his friend, calling him a man who brightened every room. Colleagues and fans alike remembered not only his comedic gifts, but also his warmth and philanthropy. George was laid to rest in Alabama, returning to the state that had shaped him. Today, George's legacy lives on in multiple forms. Reruns of The Andy Griffith Show and Hee Haw continue to bring Goober's antics to new generations, proof that his humor remains timeless. The film festival in his name endures as a beacon for aspiring filmmakers, and in Alabama, his memory is honored not just as a television star but as a son who never forgot his roots. George Lindsey's story is not merely about comedy or conflict. It is about perseverance, about embracing the roles life hands you, and about leaving behind more than laughter, leaving behind opportunities for others to dream. His journey reminds us that behind every smile is a human being, full of complexities, contradictions, and courage. And in that, George Lindsey remains unforgettable.